Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrian Alexander, Caribbean Regional Coordinator for Free the Slaves, which serves as a secretariat to the Caribbean Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons. Welcome to day 3 of the Coalition's webinar series. This series is our main observance of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons and serves as a follow-up to last year's Caribbean Anti-Trafficking Conference. Some of the topics selected for this week reflect key issues highlighted by speakers at the conference. For example, Mario Cordero, the UNODC's Program Officer for Central America and the Caribbean, said in his keynote, something very important that I think we often miss is to address demand. Almost all of the public campaigns are targeted towards either survivors or potential victims. We really have to develop public campaigns that are framed under a single message that targets consumers. Today's webinar is titled Addressing Demand, Tackling Commercial Sexual Exploitation and Forced Labor in the Caribbean. During today's deliberations, we will hear not only about public campaigns, but also innovative strategies and interventions to reduce the demand for commercial sex and forced labor. Moderating today's panel is Dr. Cherisse Francis, who pursued her PhD studies examining anti-trafficking in the Anglophone Caribbean at the University of Warwick, UK, which she completed in 2024. She's a member of the Human Trafficking Research Network and facilitates workshops for judges, judicial officers, and other stakeholders of the justice system. She's a cherished asset to our coalition and serving in multiple roles. On the panel are Dr. Warren Thompson, Mr. Kwasi Cudjoe, Mr. Neil Derrick, and Mr. Andre Charles. Warren is a social worker at heart with a passion for improving the well-being and quality of life of others. He's the Director for Intake, Investigation, Adoptions, and Court Services at the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, or CPFSA, in Jamaica. Warren holds a PhD in Gender and Development Studies and has researched and published in the fields of gender studies, social work, and community development. He is the proud father of twin sons. Kwasi is a Trinidad and Tobago-based development specialist with over 14 years' experience advancing social transformation, citizen security, and community resilience across the Caribbean. He's the founder of Men Can, a locally rooted support group where men can engage in personal development and self-reflection. Kwasi designed and led the Inside Out Dad program for incarcerated fathers and the Barbershop Initiative, which reached over 1,500 men and boys across Trinidad and Tobago. He also co-developed Project Sarah, an anti-trafficking intervention that addresses male demand and its links to human trafficking. Neil is a strategic management consultant, organizational transformation specialist, and industrial relations practitioner with over 40 years of executive leadership experience. This experience is across the energy, manufacturing, utilities, and financial services sectors. He has served in senior executive positions in major national organizations and represented employers on various ILO initiatives. Neil currently serves as the vice chair of the Employers Consultative Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Andre is employed at the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards as the head of standards development. Currently, he works as co-secretary lead from the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards with the British Standards Institute to develop an international standard in the ISO 37200, managing the risk of modern slavery, guidance for the prevention, identification, and response to human trafficking and forced labor. As usual, we encourage you to download the webinar series brochure from the Coalition's website at ccatip.org. The brochure contains photos of all the presenters, and you can also view anyone's bio by clicking on their photograph. At this time, I will yield to the moderator, Dr. Cherisse Francis. Over to you, Cherisse.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and good afternoon, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you this afternoon as your moderator, after having been in the hot seat, as it were, yesterday as a panelist in the session on youth participation. And I think that today's session is a very nice segue from yesterday as we start to talk about other populations affected by human trafficking in the Caribbean, but also we're examining from another angle human trafficking, another angle that we need to understand so that we can combat trafficking effectively, looking at the vulnerabilities and the wide-ranging impacts. And today's topic is one that is not often discussed, and when it is, it can be a little contentious. So we're looking at addressing demand, tackling commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor in the Caribbean. And just to give you a little bit of context before I hand over to the panelists, when we look across the Caribbean, most of our legislations focus on supply side criminalization, so traffickers and facilitators. We do have a few jurisdictions that look at demand through their policy, but also through their awareness campaigns. Belize, for instance, in their prohibition against trafficking legislation, does impose liability on businesses and transport operators. They also have a billboard that says, "Here for child commercial sexual exploitation, we have a place for you." And the graphic is of prison bars, indicating that if this is what you're coming to Belize to do, you can and will be punished according to our legislation. Guyana similarly speaks to offenses for corporate bodies and misuse of transportation, which looks at supply chains and what could potentially be happening, causing vulnerabilities there. So today we will be looking at some Caribbean perspectives, where we are now, what can be done, and what is in the process of development. We'll also be zooming out, if you were, and looking at institutions, communities, and groups, rather than just having an individualistic look or individualistic idea of this issue. We'll be talking about gender, and we'll be looking at how nationality and gender sometimes come up in the Caribbean context as it relates to the idea of demand and our socioeconomic realities. We'll think through biases and perceptions of who can be a victim, what the term victim means, and the types of trafficking that oftentimes we consider as more valid or more harmful or in more of need of responses. So with those very short comments, I will be looking to hand over to my panelists, starting with Warren. Warren, if you could just start us off by laying some of the context for the Caribbean that I mentioned, sharing with us about gender and cultural perspectives on male demand for commercial sex, as well as Jamaica's law and some of the interventions of the Jamaican government.
All right, thank you very much, Cherisse. I'm hoping that I can do what it is that you're asking me to do. Let me share my my screen. Please confirm for me once you're seeing it.
We can see your screen.
All right, so while I talk about addressing demand for commercial, sexual exploitation and forced labor, I hope that you will forgive me for making references primarily to Jamaica, since that is the context with which I am most familiar. I want to start the conversation. Let me move quickly because I know I'm not the only speaker. So let me start by defining, when we talk about gender and culture, what do we mean? So for us, gender is a complex system of personal and social relations through which women and men are socially created and maintained, through which they gain access or are allocated status, power, and material resources within society. This is a definition from Eugene Barito. I should tell you, to simply put it, we refer to gender as the social construction of biological difference. Culture, on the other hand, is the shared set of beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that characterize a group or society. So it's a term that we use very often. We know what culture is. Now, culture intersects with gender because culture determines, for example, gender roles, gender expectations, and a culture's gender ideology determines how material and non-material resources are allocated. Now, we talk about non-material resources, we're talking about things like, as in the previous definition, power, status, even things like respect, and so on. Now, why is this important when we're talking about the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor? Why is it important to look at gender and culture? Here I have data from the Jamaica Constabulary Force on confirmed trafficking in persons cases for 2024 and 2025 for Jamaica. And if you look at it, you'll realize that all the victims in the past 2 years are females. You will also realize that majority of the reports, or the victims rather, were victims of sexual exploitation. So of 20 victims, 19 females were victims of sexual exploitation, and one female was a victim of forced labor. Now, although they're all females, it's important to look at the ages. All the 2024 victims were 14 to 16 years old, and all the 2025 victims are also female, but there was one adult, one 19-year-old, and 9 14 to 16-year-old. So there are some clear gender dimensions to the phenomenon of trafficking in persons in Jamaica, and I want to suggest by extension the wider Caribbean. There is a clear demand for sexual exploitation or for sex from females within this particular age group. And the demand for sexual exploitation, as it were, is based on gender and culture, such as, for example, how we see or perceive the young female body as being equally desired and equally exploitable. The absence of male victims in the data also points to some other gender dimensions, not necessarily related to the crime itself, but more so related to how we treat with reporting, victim detection. Perhaps, there's some blindness to exploitation of some types of bodies, those kinds of things. But because we're addressing demand, we're not looking at those kinds of gender dimensions. We're looking really at what the data is saying about who we're picking up as victims of trafficking in persons. And of course, although I don't have the data, you will find very often the majority of perpetrators, and this is across the board for sexual crimes in general, majority of perpetrators are men, are males. Now, gender norms, unequal power relations, economic structure, social expectations regarding masculinity and sexuality influence and shape the demand for commercial sexual exploitation in the Caribbean. And because the data points primarily to sexual exploitation, I may talk about that a little bit more. Now, commercial sexual exploitation is not driven solely by individual choices, but by broader systems of power that privilege certain groups while marginalizing others. I'm going to now look at some of what I think are some of the drivers of demand that are related to gender and culture within the Caribbean. One, I'm going to go through each of these in detail, but we generally have patriarchal cultures. Then there is a particular way Caribbean masculinities and sexualities are expressed. We do have situations of economic inequalities between men and women, and we're often a culture of transactional sex that is normalized. There are some age-based power imbalances, and of course, because of where the Caribbean is situated, there are some, and because of the socio-economic situations as well, there are some migration factors. Now, the Caribbean cultures remain largely patriarchal, even though women have made significant gains in terms of education and management. There is still a way in which there is male privileging, both historical and contemporary male privileging. There is a preference in many spaces for male leadership. And of course, there's also an expectation culturally that men are more dominant in sexual relationships as well as in social settings. What we see often too is there is a privileging of men in position of authority, or there's a protection of the community for men in authority, even when those men commit crimes, including sexual crimes, or those men are noted to be predators who are targeting young girls for or have sexual desires for young female bodies. There is some protection that the communities afford those persons, especially if those men have power and authority. And in the Caribbean, well, in Jamaica in particular, there is a hero-provider model of leadership that that many communities hold on to, and where the hero provider is also the person who's exploiting people. There is some allowances given, and the communities will even protect that hero provider if that person is fulfilling other needs of the community. Of course, when men, as I said, when men have status and prestige and so on, then there's some amount of leeway given for them to have sexual access. So we have situations, for example, of sexual grooming, where if a man is providing resources to a family, then the family think it is okay. They think it is okay for that for a child in the family to enter into a sexual relationship with this man. Of course, in Jamaica, it is illegal to sell sexual services. So this is looking at commercial sex work now, but it is not illegal to buy those services. So we don't often penalize the patrons, but we penalize the providers of the service. The only exception is where if the service is being provided by a child, or if the person is confirmed as a victim of trafficking, then, and of course you need the evidence for that, then the person who's purchasing the services can be charged. But outside of that, there's a way in which we say in law it is okay for you to buy sexual services if you desire it. But then on the other hand, we say it is not okay for a woman or anybody else to sell sexual services. So that is a clear gap that allows demand to flourish. And of course, in the Caribbean, we have there's a male hypersexuality, where the way in which you construct masculine identities and sexualities suggests or says to our young boys, for example, that you are supposed to demand sex or desire sex, even if who you're desiring it from doesn't necessarily want to give it. And sex can exist outside of like monogamous relationships and so on. So men are expected to have multiple sexual partners. They are expected to show sexual prowess and dominance in relationships. And I quoted some lyrics from popular music. I don't know. Valiant is a young Jamaican artist. I understand he's about 27 years old now. But I went to a party recently with some young people. I was just going there to drop off something, and I heard the music start to play. And every single person, I'm talking about young adults in their early 20s, everybody started to sing the song. I was wondering, which song is this, and who is this artist? And then I realized that I was told that Valiant is this young, vibrant artist that the young people love. But if you look at the lyrics, there's a way in which Valiant portrays women and women's bodies and the relationships between women and men. So, for example, he says, and we have been hearing this for many, many years in popular music, that a man must have enough girls, must have, and may have sex with enough girl and break every heart and so on. So there's an expectation that men, that their sexual desires ought to be satisfied, right? And of course, there's an interplay of sex and violence, where we say it is okay for men to perceive sex as something that should be forced or something that should be violent. And I will say, I give my own experience when I was growing up, and I was very silly at the time. But when I was in high school and getting more exposed to sex, put it that way, I thought that how a man would show or demonstrate that he's doing well in a sexual encounter is if he causes the female to experience pain. And I literally believe that was true. I mean, when I became an adult, I learned that that was foolish. But young boys are taught these things, and in causing the young lady to feel pain, or causing a female to feel pain, is also to almost diminish the worth of that person. So commercial sexual exploitation is also seen as a means of living out that fantasy of violence. And if you engage with commercial sex workers, for example, they will tell you that many of and I was having this conversation recently with someone who does work with commercial sex workers, that many men seek commercial sex services because they are able to exert violence on the commercial sex workers in a way that they cannot in their own relationships. So they can't exert that kind of violence on their wives, so they seek other bodies to exert that kind of violence and live out that fantasy on. And of course, there's a way in which we see women's bodies as exploitable objects for men's pleasure. And there's a lot of feminist research and work on this idea. And as I said, it's cultural. We see that women's bodies are, we teach boys that women's bodies are there to satisfy your sexual desires. And even if you need to exploit the body for that desire. And of course, I'm hoping that across the region we are changing this kind of narrative. But these are things that have persisted, and we see them living out in being expressed in the popular music as well. And of course, economic inequalities between men and women, poverty and the feminization of poverty remains a key driver, for commercial sexual exploitation and, of course, forced labor as well. We see people, of course, the victims who are vulnerable to scams, and we see a progression into exploitative situations. So, for example, we see situations where a lady is, gets a job working in a bar, and the men in the bar like her, so the owner of the bar says, maybe we can do a little dancing, to make a little bit more money. She needs the money, so she starts dancing. And as she starts dancing, the men start to give her the money and start to touch her and so on. So the owner say, if you want to make a little bit more money, you could, start having sex with these persons. So there's a progression from tending a bar to dancing to, selling sex. And then the owner of that establishment, of course, is benefiting. And the woman, because of her situation of poverty, ends up becoming exploited in that way. So we see a progression into exploitative situations in some instances across the region. And of course, very often, because the victims are in an unequal position of power due to economic need, due to poverty, and they may become dependent on the person who is filling that need, that dependence is sometimes misinterpreted as consent. And this is tied to the normalization of transactional sex within the region. So I will see coming out in the music as well. There's a lot of music, popular music, to suggest that the sexual relationship is one of exchange where sex is provided in return for money or whatever other kind of benefit. So I use Valiant again, 2 of his songs from 2025 to show how we see that coming out. Here he said, "Turn upon your back as have money in my hand." So the first part is referring to the sexual act, and the other side, he has money in response to what you're doing. Right. So you see that coming out in the music. Now, the normalization of transactional sex, this is something that has been, it is historical, and it exists today. Where men who have sex with women expect that to get the sexual favor, I give her something in return, and there's a way in which even women are socialized, young girls are socialized to think that way. So there's an expectation that if he wants to have a relationship with me, then he has to be giving me money, right? So the economic situation is one of the things that support, as it were, the demand for commercial sexual exploitation, because we see sex as something that can be exchanged for money. So if you have the money, if you have the resources, then you should be able to get sex from who you want it from if you're able to make that exchange. We see the age-based power imbalances as well. The historical and cultural notion that children are dispensable. This is coming out. This is coming from time immemorial. Children are dispensable beings. And I won't go too much into detail on this, but we see children as being dispensable, children as being dependent, and also because of that dependence, being exploitable beings. And one way in which children are exploited, of course, is through sexual exploitation. We also see across the region where there's an early initiation of sexual relations for children, especially girls. Very often, girls are initiated into sex early by either an older boy or an older man, right? And these things, there's a way in which the young female body is portrayed as being desirable, and the man who is able to get it, the one who is able to exploit that body, gets chips, as it were. He gets I don't know if you know what I mean when you get chips. You get ratings, right? Because you're able to make that kind of sexual conquest. So as a result of that, sexual grooming becomes normalized with many young girls entering into sugar daddy arrangements, and of course, younger victims often attract higher premiums where in terms of commercial sexual exploitation. So these cultural, if you want to call them norms, and I say it all the time that within the region we have cultural practices that lend themselves to the exploitation of people. They are some of the things that cause men in particular to continue to demand sexual services from bodies that they deem to be exploitable. Of course, the demand for forced labor is driven by the need for free or cheap labor where you can get it, and the economic vulnerability in the region makes it attractive for traffickers. If you can pay low wages, many people are in positions where they are paid low wages. They are either unemployed or underemployed. There are limited opportunities. So when an opportunity presents itself, then people run after it and end up becoming either scammed or becoming entrapped into a situation where they're exploited. The migration factors, of course, I think I won't go too much into detail about this because many of us know. So I'll just jump now to talk a little bit about state responses. And I'll talk about some of the things that we are doing in Jamaica to address demand. One is public awareness. We're trying to teach our communities, our societies, our populations, not just about the crime of trafficking, but about the gender norms that we have that are unhealthy that need to be shifted. And the truth is, although this is being done, significantly more work is required in this area. And I want to suggest that the changing or addressing the demand for the demand that causes people to become exploited, we can't do it alone through the anti-trafficking messages. We have to focus on changing the gender and the cultural norms that lend themselves to people becoming exploited. So from the state, we do a number of things. So we, like last year, we did a town and communities blitz. This year, we're doing a town hall meeting in recognition of World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. We do different forums, seminars, and so on. At the moment, we have a series running on the local television station looking at issues such as child abductions, sexual grooming. So these are dramatized pieces that teach the communities about, taking care of children. So we call it picnicens. And we have episodes focusing on things like child trafficking. So we're saying that the community should have a picnicens, a sense to protect our children. Of course, so we do have legislation that are addressing commercial sex work, but I talked about the gap that exists, and that gap, of course, allows demand to flourish while addressing the supply side. So that is an area that requires attention because we need to also target the people who are demanding the services. From the law enforcement, we do ad hoc operations or raids at known spots, areas where commercial sex workers work, or areas where they might have clubs, bars, and so on. Especially, and of course, we're always listening out to see if there are children in these establishments and so on. And we do have more than one reporting hotline, so people are able to report child trafficking or human trafficking in general by calling either 211 or 311, and these are 24-hour toll-free hotlines. And they're of course confidential for people to, register their tips. Let us know the information that you have so that we can launch an investigation and respond to both protect victims and apprehend the perpetrators. And one of the things that we're looking to do here in Jamaica, of course, is to establish a child protection early warning system that will help our sensitized communities to picking up on when those young girls in particular are at risk or are in situations that could end up becoming a situation of exploitation. So this is something, it's in its very early stage of development, but it's something that we are currently working on. And I want to end by just showing you this coming out of the Town and Communities Blitz that we did last year. We told people about what child trafficking is, talked about exploitation, and asked them to take a picture to show that they're taking a stand against child trafficking. And we believe that by sensitizing the communities in this way, teaching them about exploitation, letting them know what kinds of cultural practices or what kind of gender norms are inappropriate or need to be shifted to make the playing field more even and cause, don't cause one set of persons to become exploited at the expense of another because of power imbalances and so on. We believe that that kind of information and awareness raising is crucial to addressing the demand issues that feed the crime of trafficking in persons. So I'll end with this clip.
Thank you so much for that, Warren, as we're continuing to watch your clip. I really love that you gave us that contextual idea of what's happening in Jamaica, thinking through how we see bodies, especially female bodies, so gender and culture, the ideas of power that you raised. It was really good to see you sharing those lyrics and those contexts, those cultural contexts that facilitate sexual relations and by who, but also that you indicated that some of the challenges that we see are based on what we teach our boys, who then become our men, about sexual encounters. So, Kwasi, I know that you are the founder of a group called Men Can that work with men locally in Trinidad and Tobago to create safe spaces for support. So I want to bring you into the conversation here after what Warren has shared, especially about Jamaica's government's response to this issue, for you to tell us a little bit about community-based solutions based on your experience to bring men and boys into this issue from the demand side as allies. So I'll pass over to you, Kwasi, for your intervention.
Hi, pleasant good day, everyone. Thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start off by asking everyone here, and you don't need to answer, have you ever heard about the parable of the river? And that parable comes in different iterations, but one speaks about a village and a raging river, and these villagers seeing children that's coming down the river, and every time they run into the water and they will grab a child. And then another few seconds, they will see another child and they will keep running into the river until one villager was brave enough or thought out of the box and said, you know what, I'm going to walk upriver. So today I want to talk or focus on upriver, before exploitation, which is workplace, before standards are applied, before the enforcement intervenes. The demand actually begins in communities, but not only in communities, and Warren spoke about it, in attitudes, norms, behaviors, and how persons view people. How community engagement either refrains from or engages men and boys. The thing about it is men and boys are allies, and we have to see this as not as a side activity, but as a core or critical pillar of prevention. So why community matters? Demand is socially learned. And I'll just sort of go through, because I must thank Warren. You laid an excellent foundation. A lot of what I'm going to speak about is based on how men and boys, are socialized, some of the negative gender stereotypes that are performed, and how we can really engage with them to, bring them on board as allies. So there are harmful ideas about masculinity. be it objectifying females. And when you objectify persons, you dehumanize them. And now a female becomes a commodity that can be purchased, that can be discarded, and things are simplified. The thing is, communities can either protect or enable exploitation. Because as much as there are vulnerabilities in small island developing states, there are also strengths. Relationships travel really quickly. And we've seen it, in focus groups where a simple thing as mobilizing men to attend a session, as opposed to the institution sharing, via their social media platforms, word of mouth becomes more successful. It has a bigger impact because men and boys respond sometimes to, I want to say, who they perceive as sources of authority. So let's say that gatekeeper in the community saying, that's a really good workshop and you should attend, as opposed to the flyer coming up, be it on your social media feed or be it a hard copy. Because prevention is a citizen security strategy, as well as criminal justice response. So apart from the policing, how do we engage with and really, help men and boys look at this issue, or not only look at, but understand this issue better? So why does the Caribbean community require solutions? Because as I said, there's rapid norm diffusion in small communities. Trusted local leaders, for example, the approach of using community anchors, training up selected individuals. So let's say provide psychosocial intervention or first aid, lay responders. And these are the assets that exist in communities, be it in your sports groups, be it in your faith-based organizations, your civil society organizations, because these local leaders really have influence. When we look at men are send powerful messages to boys, directly and indirectly, how they respond to, let's say, seeing labor exploitation. Let's say that man who is going to do an extension on his home, and we would have witnessed it with the influx of Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad, where, unfortunately, they were perceived as, because they're vulnerable, cheap labor, exploited. And let's think about a community where a man says to his neighbor, if you're going to hire the people, you need to pay them the legal rate. And he may not say it how I say it. He might say, hey, you have to pay them what they worth, according to their dialect and jargon. But the thing about it, culture could reinforce and transform social norms. And what that means for us is that community-based preventions or interventions, could be scaled quickly. Because before we even reach the point of rolling out an intervention, when we recognize that communities, men and boys, are allies, we begin by sensitizing, engaging, and getting them on board. And I know we sometimes use the term get buy-in loosely, but buy-in here means helping them to understand what the issue is. Because if they don't understand the issue, just like a lot of masculine behaviors, is going to be performative support. So they may show up, but they're not tuned in. They may show up, they may be tuned in, but they may not retain. They may show up, retain, but they may not reflect. And it's steps as we go along. So what we do is create safe spaces that encourage that honest reflection and conversation. We want to hear, what your thought is on, you go to a particular institution, there appears to be a lot of young ladies there. You know that upstairs of this institution, there's rooms for rent. What do you think about that? After you take a few drinks, what do you think about paying some money to rent a girl? And we use this language as much as it's distasteful, because that's how they may be communicating. So you connect with them. But we also help them to examine their core beliefs and the root causes of these beliefs. Why do you look at it like that? And the thing about creating this safe space and these approaches, it could be adapted across issues like fatherhood or parenting, gender-based violence, and trafficking, which you're speaking now. Because we want to challenge your beliefs and your perceptions to help build that accountability, to help you now understand that you have a role in transforming the same society, because in many Caribbean territories, and I've heard it, we like to beat the government. The government are not doing nothing. And we always say to men and men can, the Stephen Covey concept of a circle of concern and circle of influence. This is a circle of concern here. It's really grand, it's big, it's huge. But within your circle of influence, what are you doing? What changes are you making? Okay, you'll continue to reprimand the government and complain, but what are you doing to either enable or prevent this particular issue? So we have MenCan. MenCan started in 2021. It started through a parenting workshop by the then Ministry of Social Development, specifically for men. And coming out of the workshop, a lot of the guys shared a willingness to remain together, to establish a formal group, because there were issues, a myriad of issues to be addressed. And as we continue to grow, we recognize that, men do struggle with a number of issues, but also sometimes they feel that there aren't enough places that they can go to where they wouldn't be judged and they would receive help. One of the things that we really drive home is, as much as we're not judging you, we're really trying to build that accountability in you. So it's not merely you get a free pass to vent and no one is going to challenge why you're thinking like that. Because this safe space, and sometimes we actually refer to it as a brave space, and I'll tell you why. Again, challenging those concepts of masculinity, where vulnerability, or being able to be open and share what you're struggling with. Are you struggling with, you are in a particular workplace, everyone solicits sex on a Friday afternoon. You feel, yeah, something is a bit off about that. Something is a bit off about where they go. But because, again, peer group pressure, which applies to adults as well, you feel that you must, conform to the norms there. What does that look like? What do you do? What do you say? Okay, you know what? I'm not comfortable in probably having a strong no at this point in time, so I might make up a lie and say, well, no, I have to pick up my son early. But we want you to reach that point where you understand why it's not a healthy behavior. You understand the damage that you are contributing to. And as I said, it works across multiple male development issues. Even when we talk about professional ethics, why it is you feel you comfortable, you could just reach up in the employer's space at any time. Why? So the thing is, we understand that awareness alone rarely changes behavior. We understand that behavior change takes some time. I always give the example that, imparting information doesn't equate to behavior change. There's so much law. Some people know that it's illegal to litter, that there's a fine, but they litter. Because there may not be self-efficacy, they may not feel empowered. Something is going on there, a disconnect between the thought and the actual action. And we want to dig down deeper into that. So what we do is that we develop, or we have developed, I want to say, structured conversations which move men, as I said, from having the information. I'm seeing babies coming down this river. I know that there are babies coming down. To reflection. Okay, something has to be up here. Something has to be. Why am I not feeling empowered to actually put my foot in the river and snatch a child out of the water? And when you get those answers to action, and the action may be calling a hotline, the action may be seeing that young lady who's vulnerable in a community, and a particular individual is picking her up at a particular time and having a conversation with the parents, the guardians. Within communities, as I said, there are these community anchors, and we need to recognize that they are assets. So we developed at MenCan something called the mango tree model, and there's our approach. Again, using culture, using terms that people could relate to. Instead of saying a theory of change, imagine a group of men in a circle, different backgrounds, and you're saying, welcome, you want to talk about this theory of change. You say, you want to talk about the mango tree model. What mango tree? And you get a discussion. And as the seed or the shared values, because we have an oral tradition just as I started with the parable of the river to draw people in, we have these conversations because in most Caribbean islands, especially men, they love to tell a story. I remember a time. And sometimes they use it and I'm talking about themselves, but I have a partner named Warren. No, it's not Warren, it's actually Kwasi. But they're seeking some sort of resolve, some sort of solution. And we start with these shared values. Now, the roots are, creating that trust, understanding that trust builds over time. Sometimes we design these nice spaces and we wonder why, yeah, men may show up, but we don't retain them because we're still working on that relationship. As I said earlier on, rapid norm diffusion happens in communities faster, especially when trust is built. And we have these safe spaces, which is the tree, the branches, because we want guys to reflect. So if you look at it, the seed is really where prevention starts. And then as the roots grow and build trust, it grows into, I want to call it that community resilience. Because now I understand my role and function. I understand how this issue may seem so large to me or big that I ask myself what I could do. But now I understand, okay, there's some numbers I could call, probably I could have a conversation in my church group or in the mosque or in the temple or whatever. Because there's also, again, some false perceptions that, men of the faith don't solicit sex. And we know from data and research that's not true. There are a number of reasons why men solicit sex, and it is not exclusive to any one group. The fruit is healthier masculinity. So these new protective behaviors and norms, and this is where men are able to reflect and practice, because when we engage men, we want to give them tangible takeaways that they can actually implement. We usually make a joke and say, what we're giving you, you don't need to take a loan to try working on it one time. It's not like we're asking you to go and build a house. You could practice, let's say, daily reflections. I've seen this particular thing happening in my community. I'm uncomfortable about it. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to sit down and devote some mental time, be it 5 minutes when I reach Jamaica, to think about, okay, who I've seen around there, what conversations I could have. Because again, when we talk about trafficking, and that is it is a crime and violence issue. Sometimes questions of liability or dangers that I could bring upon myself come into play. But the harvest is that family and community resilience, because the thing about it is citizen security is about strengthening the protective factors. Going upriver is about finding out where the issues originate sometimes. And as I said, they originate in attitudes, norms, and beliefs, and strengthening the protective factors that decrease or completely remove that risk factor. So communities are our first early warning systems. As I said, there we can, train up community anchors, because we're talking about that informal guardianship. When we talk about the village, and we like to speak about the village throughout the Caribbean, that's not an abstract theory, it's not an abstract thought. When you really look at the concept, it speaks about a lot of interrelated systems that exist, that social cohesion where people feel comfortable to share information or to speak on something within that space. And here we're saying that, we have coaches that notice behavioral changes. So if we have community anchors and a coach is trained in psychological first aid, or even has the knowledge around trafficking and what it looks like, when they realize that, be it that young lady from the netball team or the young man from the football team is, different behaviors, they can have a responsible and informed discussion. Because as men can we also say that passion only carries you so far. You're passionate about an issue, but you need the information so as not to re-traumatize persons or to cause further harm and damage. And faith leaders, employers observe. And here we see that communities can actually be the first to detect risk. The challenge is, though, to be honest, is ensuring that they know what risks look like and also how to respond safely. And as I said, sometimes there are questions about, if I make this call to this hotline, is it really anonymous? How could I, but you need to be able to identify the risk, the coercion, or identify the different factors or elements of human trafficking. And as Warren spoke about those norms, fathers really shape values. I remember Adrian spoke about Project Sarah. I remember when we co-developed that and we piloted it, Adrian was actually, one of the facilitators. And in the room, there was a conversation about sex solicitation. And the guys were saying, they talk in code when they're having because they're lying by each other now. These are professionals. And sometimes we think that, men who perpetrate these acts look a particular way. No, these are professionals talking about, they go this particular place on an evening, or they've heard about it. And I remember saying to them, when you have that conversation, you think you're speaking so discreetly or in code, and your son is in earshot and hearing that, you're reinforcing certain behaviors. Because we sometimes still think that teenagers and adolescents are stupid. I don't know why we think that, but they're picking up. Also, your daughter is hearing what is acceptable in terms of your objectification of women. You see that thing? Not even a woman. See that thing there? She look real good. She look best. You objectifying. So I remember saying to them, let me ask you a question. If in a couple years, you appear in front of your daughter, how you'd feel? And there were guys who were really frightened because they know themselves. They know the kind of acts that they perpetrate. They know the way they think. And that's when they were able to connect, hey, my behaviors are possibly harmful. But beyond, again, pegging that to somebody who's close to them, we want men to understand that these are human beings. These are people with lives, lived experiences. So we want to prepare communities, because communities are future employers. And I know we have a panelist going to speak on that. They are future workers, consumers, they are future leaders. Communities prepare these people long before the systems actually engage. So we want to really be able to provide the information, the guidance, and the spaces to really combat some of those negative ideologies and beliefs and behaviors. So I would end with some key takeaways here. In our work with men, we recognize that reduction in demand really requires change in social norms, because there is a belief you have to catch me first to stop me, or nobody wouldn't see me, not recognizing the harm that you're perpetrating. Men and boys are allies. When we look at the pillars of social cohesion, it involves people, men, women, boys, girls. So we need, in developing initiatives or programs, understand how to engage men and boys. As I always say, we need strengths-based language, because men interpret deficit-based language, i.e., you need to fix something in you, turns away men. So you start with the existing, similarly, when you use a positive youth development approach, you start with the existing strengths and you build from that. Similarly with men. Community engagement is a citizen security approach. From it, we can see how in developing initiatives, we can integrate different methodologies, be it through art, through sport, even diaspora networks. And prevention is everyone's responsibility. If you look at crime and violence as a public health issue, and we understand some of the Caribbean Charter for Public Health, one of the key components of it is creating partnerships, strong partnerships. And the partnerships there don't only exist at an institutional or systemic level, but within communities, be it in informal networks and informal networks. So I'll end with this quote here, which says, every conversation that changes one man's perspective, one boy's perspective, strengthens an entire community. So thank you. And I hand back over to the moderator.
Thank you so much for that, Kwasi. Now I just want to turn to Neil. Neil, I know that given that your work comes at the intersections of organizational transformation and industrial relations, I wanted to ask if you could share with us about the role of representative organizations in holding employers accountable. For those of you who are joining us, I will be sharing Neil's slides on his behalf. So if you hear Neil saying to me, next slide, that's the reason. So Neil, you can unmute your mic.
So
I will share your slides.
I did unmute, Cherisse, thank you. And thanks, Adrian, colleagues, fellow panelists. I'm glad that Kwasi would have walked me up the river because I think that's where I wanted to start. And not because I'm paying any less attention to the issues discussed, and the issue of victims, the issue of trafficking, because I'm not watering it down in any way. But I think today I really want to look at the whole issue of demand, and that issue of designing organizations that prevent exploitation. So maybe we go to the next slide, because the next slide really poses that question: why does demand for forced labor continue to exist? All right, and even while we kind of think that through our minds, try to put an answer to it, all right? I think the most important part for us as we look at that is to start understanding that it is not just in criminal, all the issues are not just with criminal intent. That we could have issues of forced labor that happens in systems that are considered legitimate, labor markets, supply chains, organizations that are designed and managed. And I think that's why I think today we kind of want to talk about that. And maybe if we go to the next slide, I want to do a little bit of reframing and start to look at that chain, which is the economic systems, things like competition, migration, informality, drives business decisions, right? It seems like the cost of doing business, the speed, whether it is done by you, outsourced, contracted, the whole issue of recruitment. Who recruits, whether this is recruitment by an organization, people are supplied by recruiters. And then we look at the worker experience. What does the worker really get that experience, and then the outcomes? And I'm saying that it could happen both ways, that those things could be well aligned and in that regard provide very good experiences. And it could also be ill aligned and rather than provide good experiences, it ends up as exploitation. And I want to go back just before we leave the slide in terms of economic, that issue of competition, migration, and especially migration and informality. Because I think one of the issues that we have, that we clearly, if we go to the next slide, if we go to the next slide, so in this slide, sorry, we are saying that somewhere between 3 in every 4 employees in the Caribbean are in informal organizations. And some of those that we could quickly think about might be things like construction, agriculture, fishing, hospitality, domestic work, services like that. And because we now have migration, right? And just for Trinidad, I look at Trinidad numbers, Trinidad in 2024 hosted about 113,478 migrants, right? And we are saying that globally, there's somewhere about 27.6 million persons who are actually in forced labor. And I say that to say that, which was mentioned a little bit by Kwasi as he spoke, the issue of, we hire a venue and we pay them less. We don't see that as the issue of forced labor. And it is because, we have that point, and I'm not saying in any way but I'm saying that it creates an area for exposure where, because we have such high levels of informality, because we have high level of migration and we have a lot of migrants, right? And they have to survive unregistered, right? It leaves a lot of room for that kind of pressure. So if you go to the next slide, is that while in the end process, as we just looked at, we talk about exploitation as the end process. We have to look at where the drivers come, because again, it starts, as I was just saying, with the external and structural pressures. A simple thing like competition. And large organizations may not see it, but we go to these tender systems that speaks to the lowest cost. And we don't even have systems that for, I remember when I worked for Petrotrin, I served as Vice President, Human Resource and Corporate Services for Petrotrin for a while. One of our collective agreements said that where we contracted out work, that was less than 80% of the engineers' estimate. As part of our agreement with the union, we if we had to do something like that, we had to provide explanations of how we came to our numbers. And we might see that as important, but when we look at you're looking at contractors have to survive. So if you carry down the rates that fully well we can't be able to deliver those rates at even the minimum wage, then we are also creating that system for exploitation. I think that's one of the things that we need to look at. So as we go forward, we look at this whole issue of the external structural pressures, business pressures, organization choices, how we recruit, whether we could provide the normal conditions, things like social services. All that has to do a lot with how we design our very procurement systems, the things that we consider to be acceptable and not acceptable. So why we may say that a lot of it comes from the exploitation at the level of where you have a lot of the migrants and the informal systems. But we have to also look at how the large formal systems drive that and how much we could do for changing that behavior. I know that a lot of those conversations, we've looked at some things like, if I just use Trinidad examples, things like the NIS and those laws, which try to force some systems of social services. Because even as we look at it, we have people who accept jobs and they think that they're getting away because they don't pay the social services. But when they retire at age 60, and between age 60 and age 65, they don't have an income. That's when we start asking ourselves if what we think was legitimate is not a system of forced labor. And really, I think what we want to do today is more to kind of examine ourselves in terms of whether we are actually following the tenets of decent work. If you go to the next slide. We have to see that decent work is not just a desired outcome, right? It is part of an entire operating system. And a lot of it will come based on how our systems are actually designed to prevent exploitation. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So we push from I think both presenters that went before of law and policy. Law and policy is on one end, the worker experience is at the next. But how many things happen between the creation of those laws and policies and how it actually diffuses down to the experience that the workers get at the next end? The issue of governance. the issue of leadership, right? And I'm saying governance from the issue of board oversight. What is it? Do these boards really drive? How do they manage oversight? Our leaders, what systems are we creating, right? And have we built those capabilities into our leaders, our supervisors, our managers? How do they see that? How do they see that as an issue of design? Do they see that as, okay, fine, yeah, okay, we could get them as cheap, so we take them as cheap, without looking at the social impact of that. So my next slide is a model that really puts decent work in the center and reminds of the number of things, as we just spoke of, that are impacting to create that decent work system. So as we go back a little bit to the next slide, again, I kind of want to look a little bit at the roles. I know that one thing is that we have a lot of speakers here with a lot to say. So I think there is a challenge for time, which I know we entered this conversation on. But what kind of training are we really giving to the different groups? Are we providing that the board with what the tools that they need for oversight? Or do they understand issues like risk appetite? And the executive, how do they hold themselves accountable? Yes, we have issues of resource management, but how much do they hold themselves accountable? The type of recruitment contracts that we get generated by our HR people, do they deal with all the legal things that we are supposed to deal with? Issues like taxes, issues like payments, social security payments. Are we designing systems with pensions, things like that looks at the longevity, right? Understanding the social drivers of people. And procurement. What are our procurement people putting when they are going to buy these services? What are they looking for? And again, our operations supervisors, do they have very clear targets that understand what these drivers mean and how do they apply it? Because all these things escalate when we get to the front line. So my next slide puts a little diagram that says at the very start, we speak to human, at the very start, we speak to human dignity, right? Decent work and human rights, right? And that is overlapped by our purpose and values. And it reminds us of all the things that sit on that, the governance, the leadership, the people. Again,
Oops, I think we lost him.
It appears that we have lost our presenter. So I'm just going to use Chair's prerogative until he comes back. And I will move to Andre because I actually think that Andre's presentation will flow from this. And then if Neil comes back, we can give him a few minutes to complete his thoughts there. But Andre, I know you tend to do a lot on standards and organizations, which would bring together some of the concepts that Neil was just talking about. So could you tell us a bit about the ISO draft guidelines that you've been working on?
Let me share my slide, and good day to everyone. Good day to all the attendees. I think Mr. Derrick's presentation was, well, I mean, that was the perfect presentation before this one. Let me just see. Can you guys see my slide in? Hold on a second. It's taking a little bit. There you go. Can you see it in presentation mode?
Yes, it has just come up in presentation mode. It is now at the first slide.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for that, Dr. Francis. So good day, everyone. My name is Andrew Charles. I'm from the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards. I'm the head of standards development, as Adrian noted earlier on. And what I came to do today is speak about the ISO draft guidelines for managing the risk of modern slavery. It's a standard that is still being developed. It's going into its final draft stage right now, and the ISO process utilizes different secretariats from around the world. So let me just move on into my slides. It will be presented here. And it's really a good segue from Mr. Derrick's presentation. I think he could have been, or he should have been on the ISO technical expert team who are part of developing this standard, this guidance standard. So again, really as part of the TC 309 governance in organizations, a proposal came up to develop a standard such as this one, managing the risk of modern slavery, for the prevention or an identification and response of human trafficking and forced labor, which was in keeping with some of Mr. Derrick's slides a while ago, which is looking at more directly. The first two speakers spoke very directly and very, very coherently and cohesively about what is the impact of the men in the society and the community and the way we view women. My presentation as a standards developer and part of the secretariat developing this standard is how is the risk of modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking prevented or can be prevented in organizations. So it looks at a very organizational approach to it rather than a community approach to it. It's very organizational in its intent. So as I was saying, it's part of the TC 309 under ISO on governance in organizations. And Mr. Derrick just noted something also, human dignity. It now falls under the subcommittee in that governance of organizations, a human dignity subcommittee, where it's been felt that this deals with very particularly human rights, human dignity, and areas of that sort. We're noting really it's a field of governance that we see a lot of movement and a lot of change in the world towards. So there's a strong belief and voting for this proposal to establish this guidance standard. And again, this standard is being developed with a co-secretariat between the British Standards Institute of the UK and the St. Lucian Bureau of Standards. Managing the risk of modern slavery. Again, as we noted, it was developed over 2 years and it's just coming to a close. In fact, at the start, I think February, if I remember correctly, February of next year, the final standard should be out, where we would have gone through the final draft stage and we would be into a guidance document that organizations could utilize. And many different experts from around the world were engaged and are still being engaged. In fact, the final voting is going to be done through the national standards bodies for all the countries around the world, and key countries included St. Lucia, the UK, China, Japan, Nigeria, India, Argentina. We had a conference even in Australia recently. We had one in Jamaica the year before. There was Germany, Canada, and many other countries. And the idea was, again, that all of these countries have a different interplay. And I think Kwasi and Mr. Derrick, they both spoke about how is that played in a cultural sense? How is it seen from a different well, in this case, it's from a cross-border sense. How is it related in a cross-border sense? And the reason why you have all these countries is that you want to get a global perspective on it. And it's very important to get a global perspective, because I think Mr. Derrick and again Kwasi said this, that what might be deemed normal in one setting is not acceptable in another setting. So to get all of those different nuances, all of these countries have taken part. The scope of this guidance standard, again, it's a guidance standard and not a requirement. I'll explain that to mean that the guidance standards look at recommendations of best practices for organizations, and it doesn't matter the organization size. It could be a multinational corporation or one-person organization that needs to operate whilst recognizing the risk of modern slavery. And again, within the scope, it looks at the prevention, how to identify it. And if I again take from Mr. Derrick's slides, on the final slide that was there before his call was lost, he dropped off, was looking at, are we just looking at training, or are we looking at identifying the risk, responding to the risk, remediation of the risk, which is very much in keeping with what the standard tries to bring across. Is it are the organizations just looking at training? And I remember a lot of the discussion is, are you just doing training to fill a tick box to tick? Yes, we've done the training. No, we've not done the training. Or has it been the training now allows the staff, and again, that senior management component, to recognize the risk, identify it, and how can remediation be done? Right? So it's very important in terms of the way it's seen across borders and across organizations. To the contents of the standard, how the standard is set up. The standard would normally, and any ISO standard would have a format where it looks at the introduction, the scope, the references, terms and definitions, because again, I have to note, terms and definitions between countries are extremely important, especially when translations come into play. These are extremely important. So a lot of time has been spent on terms and definitions. And again, I'm going to give more of an overview of the standard as to where it comes in and some of the nuances it will bring. It looks at the context of the organization. So how do these different organizations that might be affected, how do they in their way approach the risk of forced labor? How can they be a part of prevention of forced labor? And it deals a lot with its supply chain. So it looks at risk assessment, leadership and commitment, which again, Mr. Derrick noted. How does the senior management see this? It looks at support, the operations. How do you go back and measure through performance and evaluation? And finally, how do you engage in improvement of your system to continuously improve the forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, risk prevention? So some of the slides I have, I'm just noting some of the salient areas of the standard. As you can imagine, this standard is it's 170 or so pages long, but I'm including a few salient areas of the standard. So what constitutes forced labor? And we along the spectrum, you have forced labor at the highest point where a person cannot refuse or cease work due to coercion, threats, or deception, and they may be deprived of personal freedom where they're actually locked away. Many cases in different places around the world, including the Caribbean, they're brought to a work site. Once they've completed the work in the work site, they're then taken back, transported back to an area where they are held. Many times, if the person is a migrant, the passport is taken away from them and they cannot freely move. All right. Then it goes all the way down, and we could see you have dangerous or substandard working conditions. And again, what are the conditions that are given? Can they refuse, or can a person refuse or cease work? Is the person fairly paid? Is the person required to work excessive hours without their consent and the payment for those excessive hours? And it goes all the way into decent work, which is on the other end of the spectrum. The worker's rights are respected. The person is free, or the employee is free to refuse work or cease work, because again, it's their own right. Are they paid a fair wage, and is it a safe workplace? So all of these will utilized to look at how do you look at forced labor. To the next slide. What constitutes modern slavery? Another slide. So again, when we looked at the umbrella of modern slavery, and again, that is a term that has differences of agreement in terms of what is the definition globally. We saw that, okay, forced labor, human trafficking, forced marriage, and the worst forms of child labor were all held under that umbrella of modern slavery and could all be considered under that umbrella of modern slavery. So that was considered, again, when we're looking at all of these different parts, how does the global standard take those into consideration? And how would that be treated by the organizations when following the standard to identify what is modern slavery, what is forced labor, and how do they treat it? Again, so the standard looks at an organization and it focuses very heavily on its supply chain. It focuses very heavily on not just what's under its direct impact, but what's under its indirect impact. And if you note the diagram here, it looks at where you have your organization in the center, then you have your supply chain just wider than your organization, where you do have influence, going into a wider value chain, and finally a much wider sphere of influence. And within that, how do you determine what between your supply chain, your value chain, and your sphere of influence, how can you influence those to ensure that your organization is not engaging in human trafficking or engaging in any indirect or direct way for human trafficking or forced labor? Next one, how can the organization cause, contribute, or be linked to the modern slavery, and how should it inform the way the organization responds? So again, at the top, you have the adverse impact. And we can see in the next level, we have caused by the enterprise, contributed to by the enterprise, or directly linked to the enterprise's organizations. And what we see again from the previous slide, whether it's the organization itself hiring persons, the organizations through its supply chain, how they impact through its value chain, and finally via its sphere of influence, at each of those levels, how can it either cause the forced labor, human trafficking, contribute to it, or be directly linked to it, again via the continuum of supply chain all the way to sphere of influence. And from that, at your final level, how can you mitigate against that? How can you remedy the impacts? How can you seize or prevent it? How can you use your leverage within your supply chain, your value chain, or your sphere of influence to achieve no or reduced human trafficking, forced labor, especially forced labor, right, and modern slavery within your area, your sphere of influence? Finally, these are my last sets of slides because I recognize the time of 15 minutes. I'm at 12. At the end of the standard, the guidance document, it was felt on discussion that such a large document normally needs an expert in the area. And when you look at organizations, especially fewer person, small or micro enterprises, how can a single person or two persons who are entering their supply chain influence? And many times their ability to influence their supply chain is significantly less than a larger multinational corporation. So what are some quick rapid fire questions and ways in which persons in an organization who are not trained can deal with some of these issues? So for every chapter, there were some sub-clauses of importance and the organization asking itself some of these questions. So I'm just going to give a few examples. So the modern slavery risk assessment, under the stakeholder engagement, you will ask yourself, has the organization engaged stakeholders in the processes in managing the process of modern slavery risk? And the stakeholders are all of the persons affected. Staff, their staff who are internal customers and possibly external customers and persons within the supply chain. The supply chain mapping. Has the organization considered modern slavery risks within its supply chain? So you ask yourself, okay, if I'm a processing company and I'm getting, let's say, cocoa I'm importing cocoa, I'm buying cocoa locally, have I done due diligence? If I've heard that they might be employing child labor, or not paying a fair wage, or having persons from having migrants from a foreign country not being fairly paid, not being fairly treated, and are holding them against their will, should I still engage with that supplier within my preferred suppliers? Or should I exclude this supplier and look for a fair supplier who's not engaging in that? So you're doing a risk assessment. Moving to the next one, leadership and commitment. And Mr. Derrick spoke about that in terms of the senior leadership or senior management of an organization. So to top management, has the organization demonstrated leadership and commitment in addressing modern slavery? In other words, have you put your money where your mouth is? Top management would be the group that directs resources. Are resources being justly put and adequately put into different areas of the organization to ensure that this risk is mitigated? Is there a modern slavery policy? And the organization will ask itself, has it established a policy? It could be a forced labor policy that it decides that it's going to follow. Again, leadership and commitment. On to the final one, because I'm at time. Operations, performance and evaluation and improvement. I'll take one from two. So in the human resource and labor management, has the organization provided workers with information on labor rights, their modern slavery policy, anti-discrimination policy and procedures? And again, going back to the previous presenter, Mr. Derrick's presentation, has there been training, or is it further from training where you could do risk identification, mitigation, and remediation? And finally, into the improvement, has the organization continually identified opportunities for improvement to effectively address modern slavery / forced labor? Has an organization done that? And those are some of the areas in the guidelines that are seen and noted to be an easy way an organization could get in, follow the guidance document from ISO, which is being developed right now. It's within draft, but it will be fully published by early next year. And can an organization follow that? And with following that, would you get the ideal outcomes? One thing I would like to note is that there are some countries around the world, the UK is one of them, Australia is another one of them. They have put modern slavery acts in place. I could see a future where, and it's a future in some of our export market countries where they're asking in a fair trade sense, are our producers doing due diligence in every sense of the way? Is there a fair wage paid? Are the workers under duress? And our market access may be in some ways, in some niche areas, affected by whether or not we adhere to these as a region with our organizations. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I pass it back on to Cherisse.
Thank you so much for that, Andre. And now I have 2 minutes or 3 minutes for rapid fire questions from the chat for you before I hand back over to Adrian. So Andre, this question is for you. One of our audience members asked if Trinidad has been engaged or hopes to be engaged with the guidelines, the draft guidelines.
So yes, we originally, Trinidad does sit on the ISO TC 309, governance in organizations. We do not have an expert from Trinidad. However, we do have some other experts for some of the committees. What would tend to happen is that you guys have a vote. What I would like you all guys to do, since you're following this presentation, this webinar, is you could always contact TTBS, Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, and ask them, show your interest, and tell them based on the voting that you'd like to view the draft document. And that draft document can be made available to you guys through that, to the person who's interested, and to any other person who would be interested in, yes, TTBS, Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. Thanks for that, Cherisse. All right.
You are more than welcome. And the second question I want to pose to Warren, one of our audience members has asked, how can we shift cultural norms and media messages that normalize the objectification of girls and risky sexual behaviors to help prevent the grooming and exploitation that leads to child sexual exploitation in the Caribbean?
All right, thank you for the question. I think, Cherisse, are you hearing me? Okay, great. Yeah. I think so cultural change takes time. That's one thing that we have to, be aware of. But I think we have to engage with our media partners, engage with our artists, engage with the people who are creating artifacts for the culture to get them to come on board. Because we can be preaching one thing, but then when our musicians are preaching a different message and our television stations are doing something else, then we're working, at odds with each other. So I think we have to engage those players and get those players to get the message and to make some commitments. In the same way that we try to get corporations to make commitments to ensure that their supply chain is free of forced labor and those kind of things. I think we need to get the people who are creating intellectual property to come on board as well and give us some assurances that you're not spreading a message that suggests that people are expendable, exploitable, etc. So I think that's one way that we can start. And of course, people have to start in their own homes, teaching our children what kinds of behaviors are acceptable and are appropriate in our community groups. Whatever the sphere of influence is, we need concerned citizens to spread that message that there are aspects of our culture that are, let us say, evil, that are bad, that are not good, and spread the message to say these are ways in which you can change.
Thank you so much, Warren. And there was another question, but I believe that those questions from our audience member, Jada, need to have a much longer discussion than the time we have today. So Jada, I have taken note of your question, and the Caribbean Coalition, I will, as a steering committee member, we will get some information to you in response to your questions. Because the conversations do continue after this week, and your questions are about working with children from low-income backgrounds and preventing sexual activity for financial reasons. So we will aim to get some resources or some responses to you after today, because it would require a much longer conversation. With that, all that's left for me is to say thank you and hand back over to Adrian to do the wrap up for us. My apologies, Adrian, also for adopting future work on behalf of the coalition for you.
That's not a problem, Cherisse. Thank you so very much, you and your wonderful panelists. I think we covered a lot of ground. And I love the way that both Warren and Kwasi's presentations were able to gel, and how what they shared, others were able to draw from it in speaking about forced labor. As you said, time does not permit answering all of the questions. And I had so many questions in my own head, but I didn't want to put them in the chat. So once the speakers are willing, we can probably arrange something like a Caribbean Connections interview, where we can field some of the questions from individuals and share some more and put that into context. So you'll have a lot more time to be able to express, and we'll be able to put that up on the coalition's website, our Caribbean Connections podcast playlist. So I will yield to Sandra, because I think we heard a lot, especially in terms of our culture in the region. And some people may need to decompress, because it may bring back memories as well of some of the things that individuals may have faced in the face of some of these cultural norms, which, as Warren said, we can describe some of them as evil, but they certainly are not serving the interests of our children, even if they may be serving other people's interests. So, Sandra, I would hand over to you if you'd kindly take us through a brief self-care session, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Cherisse. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to all our panelists that's here and our audience. Now it's time for us to decompress, and we're going to do our self-care routine. And, first we have to what? Stand, right? We're going to stand. If you're sitting, we're asking you please to stand. If you're in a safe place that you can stand, right? And then we're going to do some stretches, right? So we're going to go to the left, which probably is your right. And we're going to stretch, because we've been sitting for a while. We've taken the whole lot. And we're going to stretch and hold it. And then we're going to go upwards. We're going to hold it. And we're going to go hands down and hold it. Oh, I hope that feels better. It feels better for me. So to fill you in, absent yesterday, I am up in Maryland with Shamir. Shamir had a birthday yesterday, and so I came up yesterday And we started off our day with self-care. Our self-care routine went like we went to a spa called King Spa, and it was a very luxurious place, I must say. We really enjoyed our time there. We're able to go in there, different rooms like for salt, decompress, charcoal, even gold, all different. It was just a wonderful atmosphere for you to go and decompress. Now, I don't know if they have any spas where you are, but that's a part of your self-care. If you can do that once a month to go to a spa and, you know, enjoy your time there and get to decompress. And I'm going to jump right in. And as we know, caring for our mental health can lead to improve our mood, reduce anxiety, can clear our thinking, and also help to improve our relationships and impact our self-esteem, our self-worth, and confidence. So self-care tip today, what I have to share with you is, number one, you want to declutter, right? Declutter your space. A tidy environment can minimize stress and bring mental clarity. Sometimes our desk at work, we have so much on our desk at work, at home, or even our environment. Once we get that time, we don't have to wait for spring to do spring cleaning. Get the declutter. We're going to feel better. You can see better. You can think better. Second, we're going to drink a lot of water, right? Drink, especially during the summer right now. We had someone, I think last week, good friend of mine, she was out in the sun, got dehydrated, had to rush to the hospital to get help because their body needs a lot of water, especially in the summertime and you're outside. So drink a lot of water, stay hydrated, and that's essential for our brain and our body function. Now, if you need help, and we're going to dive into this, I don't know who's on our platform, so when I speak in general. Seek professional help or support. Do not hesitate to reach out to a therapist or a counselor when needed. Trauma can lead to depression, anxiety, and cause more, stress on your body, right? Healing starts with being heard, right? Healing starts with what? Being heard. Not every day feels easy. Sometimes you just need a space where you can talk or vent or connect. And I know sometimes I have to stop and I give Adrian a call and say, Adrian, okay, this is what's going on. This is the yay moment. This is a moment that is, I need a little help to maneuver through what I am facing right now. So don't hesitate to have, I call them their lifeline partner. Have a lifeline partner where you can reach out and call when you get stuck in a situation or you need just to vent. And the last one is plan me time. Be intentional. Set aside moments each day just for yourself while you decompress, you grab a book and do your gratitude journal. God bless you. That's all I have for you today. And continue staying healthy.
Thank you so very much, Sandra. So this brings us to the end of day 3. Please join us for day 4 of the webinar series tomorrow, God willing, where we will be discussing strengthening collaboration, the role of coalitions and networks in combating human trafficking. You've heard Sandra mention Shemay McKenzie. Shemay will actually be one of our panelists for that particular session. Final reminder that all webinar sessions are recorded and you can access the recordings in the event lobby here on Zoom until the end of this week. So if you want to watch a session that you missed or rewatch a session, you can do so in the lobby. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Goodbye now.